Okay, everybody, thanks for coming. Welcome to the first Marine Science Seminar for the semester. It's nice to see such a big crowd in the participants window. We may have actually set a record for the number of people here, so Kristine can be happy about that.
Awesome.
But yeah, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We're really glad to have Kristine DeLong. She's an associate professor from LSU in the Department of Geography and Anthropology. And her academic training, including her PhD, was all done at the University of South Florida. She was also a postdoctoral geologist at the USGS in St. Pete. And while at LSU, she's received many awards, both for her research and teaching. Her research field is in paleoclimate. And in particular, she's made a lot of famous reconstructions of past temperature from corals. She's funded her work from many federal agencies, including NSF, BOEM, USGS, and NOAA. And we're really happy that she's here with us today to talk about the Alabama underwater forest. So with that, we'll let her get started.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to come and share the work on this project. So this year is the 10th anniversary of me working on this project. So I found out about it back in 2012. So it's been one of these research projects it keeps giving us new questions, new things to pursue, and just a fascinating topic. And like I said, we've been doing this for 10 years. There's a large group of researchers that are involved in the project, and students, federal partners, and even locals who have helped out in that. So I've listed their names here. But we'll start off with our study site. And then this is it. So it's not a place you would expect to do research on a forest, but we are offshore 10 miles off the coast of Alabama. And this particular day, it was not a sunny day, but that's typical when you're going out on the ocean doing research. So here's a map just to orient you to where the site's located. So we're just about 10 miles offshore of Gulf shores. And the site is in 18 meters of water depth, about 60 feet. And the site was found shortly after Hurricane Ivan passed over in 2004. So a local fisherman with his fish finder started getting lots of hits at a particular site. And then, on other fishing trips would go out and just kept finding at this one particular location, just getting lots and lots of hits of fish. So eventually had a friend who was a scuba diver go down and dive the spot and came back up and said there's tree stumps all over the place. And then a local reporter, Ben Raines, heard about it through the network. And he started writing stories about it and diving the spot and made some videos. So this is back in 2012 when I found out about it. I actually saw a Facebook post about swimming with dinosaurs. And I was like, what? And so I started looking at it. And it says, yeah, there's all these tree stumps underwater in 60 foot of water. So I started getting excited. So I'm like 60 foot of water. And I'm thinking about the sea level curve. And like, oh, this site could be about 10,000 years old. So that's how all of this got started. So here I'm showing also on this map. So these white lines, that is the last interglacial surface. So you'll see that the site is inland, even of the last interglacial surface as well. And I'll go into some more detail on that here in a minute. But just kind of an update since Hurricane Ivan came over and supposedly exposed the site. We also had Hurricane Sally, now almost 2 years ago, came really close over the site. And talking with some folks over at Dolphin Island Sea Lab, they said there was reports of 26-foot waves out there. So and quite a bit of scouring happened on the seafloor in this area. So again, two very strong hurricanes came really close over to the site, And that's kind of our working hypothesis, is that these strong hurricanes with large waves are causing quite a bit of scouring on the seafloor and exposing these sites. So just to kind of orient you for what we'll see underwater. So the trees that are down there are mostly bald cypress trees. So we find those all along the Gulf Coast. These trees tend to live in locations with water. So they like rivers and swamps. They typically do not grow at high elevations. So you can find them as high as 200 meters, but they tend to like to be between 80 meters and lower, so along the coastline. But they are not tolerant of salt water, so you don't find them right on the coast. They're going to be inland. So this just gives you an idea of this distribution of bald cypress trees along the coast. So I'm going to take you underwater to dive, and we're not going to find live trees underwater. What we're going to see is the stumps. So if you imagine a bald cypress tree, and if we were to cut it off right about this red line, what you see is this iconic shape to these stumps. And some of y'all may have seen these around in local restaurants or museums, or you may even have family or yourself have one of these cypress tables. So it's this very distinctive shape, and it's recognizable underwater when you see these stumps. So now let's go diving, and I'll show you some of Ben's footage from the site. And I'll turn down the bubbles. So you can see there's lots of fish at the site, and in the background, you'll see sea anemones. The sea anemones colonize the wood. So here the diver's going right along the ledge, and you can see all these pieces of wood eroding out from that ledge. And there's little stems and branches all over the place. And these larger pieces that are sticking up, here in the background, you can see them really nice, sticking up from the seafloor. So those are the stumps, and they're encrusted with sea anemones. In the ledge where this exposure is happening, at the deepest part, it's about 1 meter deep, but in some locations, it's maybe 1 foot deep at most. So it's not a very deep divot, but it's enough where the sediment's being eroded back. On top of it, there's a very thin layer of sand, and then you get these like clay, peat-rich sediments. So here the diver's swimming around, and you can see more of the wood and the stumps on the seafloor. So yeah, and all those sea anemones are covering the wood, which makes coring the trees underwater fun, because the sea anemones are coating the wood. And when I was coring the large stumps, my hands got stung by the sea anemones. So this is just swimming along that ledge where it's eroding back. And you can see these little pieces of wood that are coming out. Eventually, as that wood is exposed, it's going to get colonized by shipworms and decompose. And wood that's still in these sediments is really nicely preserved, but anything that gets exposed to the open water is being eroded. And there's a little crab there. And I'll end the video there. So it's a really neat place to dive, lots of marine life. And so here's one of the stills from some of the videos we shot. And here you can see one of those large cypress stumps in the background. And that's me coring one of the large stumps underwater with my tree core. And here's another shot of one of those large stumps. We also tried to bring one of the stumps up to the surface. So, and here's a still of one of those logs floating up to the surface. But these are really heavy pieces of wood. And on this particular trip, we did not get this piece of wood on the boat, since we have been able to recover some of the larger wood. So that just gives you an idea of what it looks like underwater at the underwater forest. So this kind of leads to these questions of, how did these stumps get offshore? Because they're in growth position. So this is where these trees lived. And why is this wood so well preserved and located offshore? And here's a picture of a piling showing the shipworms starting to colonize it and eating that wood. And eventually, if you leave wood out in the ocean, it will be completely decomposed. So eventually, any of the wood that's at the site that's exposed will become eroded, so it won't be there anymore. But we're asking questions like, is it just this one location, or is there wood that's still buried all over the place? And that's some of the things we've been doing with our research project over the last 6 years. And for the next 3 years, we'll be working on it as well. So what do we find? So here's some pictures of the wood that we recovered diving. So we brought up 23 pieces of wood. Most of it's bald cypress. There's some other tree species in there as well. So we think we have some Atlantic white cedar. The bottom two images here, J and K, this is actually a palm tree. So it's not just our hardwoods. We also found a palm tree as well. So how do you get this preservation? So you need to have the wood to be buried in an anoxic condition, so no oxygen. And for bald cypress, they live in swamps. Swamps are naturally anoxic because that water doesn't move and the oxygen gets used up very quickly. So swamps in themselves lend towards this type of preservation. You also want the wood to be buried quickly and no erosion to occur. So we started to think about, has this happened anywhere else? And this is a photo that was sent up to me by the Louisiana Geological Survey. And this is a site really close to LSU where they were building a new road. And come to find out, there's these huge cypress stumps. And you can see how tall this is. Paul's standing there next to it. And if you look at the background of this photo, there's about 10 more in the background. So cypress trees can get preserved. And since we started this study, I get phone calls all the time about somebody digging a pool or putting in a well, and they're hitting these buried bald cypress trees. And if we're interested in them. So this particular site, we did radiocarbon date these trees, and they were between 3,000 and 4,000 years old. So this preservation can occur, but this is on land. Our site's offshore, which makes it different. So begs the question of how did these stumps get offshore? So we've talked about where bald cypress trees grow. They like the coastlines. So to get these trees offshore, we have to drop sea level. And this is a map showing the last glacial maximum and what our coastlines would have looked like during the height of the last ice age. So the yellow star is where I'm located here at LSU. The red star is the location of the underwater forest. And you can see it's quite a ways inland at the last glacial maximum. And we have this nice wide continental shelf here in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And you can see Florida here is almost twice as wide as it is today. So in this map I've superimposed is that last interglacial surface here just south of Gulf Shores, where you can see these paleo valleys from the Mobile River in the past. So and our site is at the very top of this section that was surveyed. So it is inland at the last glacial maximum. So we started going out and doing some research. So in 2015 and 16, we went out and took some sediment cores. We did some geophysical surveys, and I'll show you some of the results from that work. So this picture here is our Vibra core with Sam Bentley's there in the middle and our team of students. So Jeff's over here. I think Jeff, you're here. I saw you in the list. So with these Vibra cores, we found some really interesting sediments in the bottom of these cores. So this is that dark, rich, organic peat. And you can see little pieces of wood in here. There's like a stem here. There's a chunk of wood over here. This is not what you expect to find coring out in the Gulf of Mexico. But in our 2015, we found this type of sediment in pretty much the bottom of every one of our cores. And we were hitting wood in those cores. So we couldn't go any deeper because we were hitting stumps. So how did this wood get to these locations? So here's a picture of one of our pieces of wood here. And when I first started working with Ben on this project, and he told me it was in 60 foot of water. So I was thinking about the sea level curve. So I was thinking, to get to 20 meters below sea level, we're right here about 10,000 years ago. But come to find out, once we started taking some of this wood and getting it radiocarbon dated, The lab was coming back and telling me that the wood was radiocarbon dead, meaning it was older than 43,000 years ago. It was too old for us to radiocarbon date. So we thought, okay, let's date some more wood. And we got some wood out of our sediment cores, and we also dated some of the sediments out of these cores, so the organic debris out of these cores. So eventually we got 17 dates back from either the wood or from the cores, and pretty much all of them are radiocarbon dead. We did get some dates that came back. So one of these at the very top of this peat section came back just about 42,000 years old. We had another one just below it that came back at 37,000 years old, but we dated this one again and it came back radiocarbon dead. And then here I've put these other sections that we dated down core that all came back radiocarbon dead. We did date some forams in the topmost section up here in the Holocene sand, and those came back just about 4,000 years old. So in between these two sections, we have a disconformity. So we have the Holocene sands, the late Pleistocene peats, and then an erosional surface here in between. We also did some optically stimulated luminescence dating, and that's the red dots on the sea level curve. So these all came back between 74 to 56,000 years old. So this places us in the earliest part of the last ice age. So over here in 5, this is the last interglacial, the highest sea level over here at 125,000 years ago. So these trees and this site was alive back in marine isotope stage 4 as sea levels dropping, and new continental shelf is now land, and we have the terrestrial ecosystem becoming established during this time. What's interesting is this wood is persisting and being buried all through the last ice age, and we get this really nice preservation. So it's one of these interesting things that we've been discussing and thinking about with this project is how old the site is and how it stayed buried and preserved through this last 50,000 years. So here's an animation just to show you what happened during the last ice age. So we're looking at North America. Oops, sorry. Let me start. There it goes. So I put the sea level curve up here for you. So we're going to start at the last interglacial here. The time is up here at the top left. So you can see as we go through time, sea level is going to drop as that ice sheet becomes larger, but the ice sheet is going to wax and wane. So at first it becomes very wide, and then through time, it's going to get thicker and taller. And every time this ice sheet builds, the bedrock below it gets depressed. So that's going to create a landform for the ice sheet to grow larger as it goes through time. So now we're at the point of when the underwater forest was alive about 50 to 40,000 years ago. And you'll see as that ice sheet retreats, you get these pulses in sea level that happen. And these pulses in sea level, a lot of this water coming off the Laurentide ice sheet, when it melts, is coming out to the Gulf of Mexico. So we could be seeing flooding pulses into the Gulf that could have led to the burial of the site. So, and now we've moved into the Holocene and towards modern conditions today. So that just gives you a little view of what's been happening through the ice age where this forest was located. So just a little review for some of you who may not know, the ice ages happened over the last 2 million years, and we have really nice records of the ice ages through ice cores. Ice cores, one of the things that happens with them, you can see an image here of an ice core. This is actually from Greenland, but what happens in an ice core is as snow falls through time, it's going to become more compact. But through this compaction process, it develops these little air bubbles. And eventually the air bubbles get locked off from the atmosphere, from the surface. So now we get these little time capsules of past atmospheric gas stored in the ice. And paleoclimatologists can go in and sample these air bubbles and get a reading of what carbon dioxide was like in the atmosphere in the past. And that's where these nice long records of carbon dioxide come from. We can also look at the isotopes in the ice and reconstruct temperature. So that's what these two graphs are showing us, is carbon dioxide levels and Antarctic temperatures through the ice ages of the last 800,000 years. So what's driving these regular cycles that we see in the ice ages? So we just looked at this interval here, the last interglacial to the last glacial maximum. So the direction of time has switched here. So sorry about that, paleoclimatologists, we do that all the time. We switch directions, but that's the interval we just looked at in that animation. So what's driving these cycles? These are being driven by Milankovitch cycles, which change the shape of the Earth's orbit around the sun. So these changes will change how much solar energy is reaching the Earth's surface. And this will vary by latitude. It varies depending on which of these orbital cycles are in play. So the top here, I'm showing the orbital eccentricity. This is a 100,000-year cycle where the Earth's orbit moves from being more circular to more oblique. We also have changes in the tilt cycle. So the Earth today has a 23.5-degree tilt, but this will vary as well. Particularly the higher latitudes are sensitive to this changes in the tilt. And we also have a precessional cycle, that changes due to the Earth's wobbling as it's spinning on its Earth's axis, and the orientation of the Earth's orbit around the sun will change as well. So these three movements together drive the changes that we see in the ice ages. It also changes what happens with the monsoons in the tropical regions. So let's go back to our research, and I'll show you some of the results that we've had. So here's just some photos from our geophysical surveys that we have done over the years with our coastal profiler, is one of our research vessels. So here's what the bathymetry of the site looks like. So you'll see here in this dashed line, so this is the exposure area where the wood we were just looking at in the diving videos. The red star is a location of a large stump. So this area of the seafloor, we have this kind of ridge and trough bed forms on the seafloor. So we have the sand ridge and then this trough. And we see this repeated all throughout this part of the continental shelf here in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And then this is some of the side scan sonar results where we were able to identify tree contacts over our survey site. So that's the purple boxes here. And then over here in the bottom right, this is one of the bathymetry maps. Again, now we're just looking straight down where you can see these tree contacts we were able to identify in our surveys in 2015 and 2016. So we know we have tree exposures. So we've also looked at sediment cores. So that red dot, that's the DF1 core that I just showed you the radiocarbon dates from. So now you know where that core is located. So this map shows all of the cores we've collected in 2015 and 16. So we've gone pretty much along an east-west transect in this region. And here's that DF1 core again. So this is one of our longer cores. It has this really nice long section of Holocene sand that's about 3 meters in depth. And then it moves into a Holocene interbedded sand and mud section. So that's where that disconformity is located. Then at the very bottom, the bottommost meter, we have our late Pleistocene interbedded mud and peats. And this is where we find those chunks of wood and bits of organic debris. And over here on the right, I have some zoomed in images of these different types of sediments we found in DF1. Over to the east, we find some different types of sediments. So we start to get into interbedded sand and muds. And then over at this, the far east site, we got paleosols in some of those cores. So we get some variations across the site with our sediments as well. And then here's some of the geophysical data, just looking right through this section here through the divot. So A prime to A prime, where you can see, the different types of sediment layers that we've identified through the site with sand and mud. And then the green area here is that exposure where the wood is coming out. So let's look at some of our tree ring results. So when I dove this site, we brought up 23 pieces of wood. We took those back to the lab, got out the chainsaw, took some cross sections, dried the pieces of wood. So here you can see what some of them look like. What's interesting is you'll notice a lot of this wood all has the bark on it still. And typically when a tree dies, it will stand for a number of years and lose its bark. But if it's buried immediately, it keeps the bark. So this is one of these interesting clues that we have, that these trees were buried almost immediately because the bark is still intact. Here you can see one of these cross sections, these round holes, that's from the shipworms that have started to bury into the wood and eat it. And you can see the shell of one of them here. And over here on the right is a zoomed in image of this wood where you can see these really thin annual bands in the wood. And for tree ring work, what we do is go in and measure the distance of each of these bands. And the way tree ring research works is if you have a lot of trees growing together on a site, they're all experiencing the same environmental conditions. So if there's a lot of water, they should grow a lot. So you'll get these nice wide bands. Versus if there's drought conditions or any type of stress in the environment, they're going to put on a thinner band. So not a lot of growth. And we can look at multiple trees across an area and match up these bands. So it's kind of like matching those barcodes. And that allows us to do cross dating. So Grant was able to take, out of all this wood we collected, he was able to cross date or match those bands with 10 of our trees. So what this graph is showing you is the results of building this chronology from all of these tree ring width records. So the shaded area in the background is the number of samples we were able to cross date. Oops, sorry. So the longest section is almost 500 years old. But when we get the most trees cross dated, so that's 10, oh, sorry, my mouse keeps jumping, is from the interval here from 300 to almost 500 years ago. And this is a floating chronology. We can't pin it back to an exact date because the wood is too old. So when we read this floating reconstruction, typically when we just have one or two trees that are in a cross section, this is going to have a lot of uncertainty to it. But as we go into more and more trees being able to cross date, this decreases our uncertainty. So when we look at this last 150 so years of this cross-dated chronology, we see some really interesting trends. Is that we see that the trees, they grow through these periods of reduced growth and then increased growth, reduced growth. And then here we see this really large stress event that shows up in all of the trees. And then they have this recovery that tends to cycle for about the next 50 years. And then we get this reduction in growth again. And our last ring tends to be the thinnest ring. And this is when we interpret this as when all of these trees died, because that is our outermost ring and they all coincide with each other. So this is really interesting result that all of these trees pretty much died at the same time. And we know this because the bark is still intact. Had we lost the bark, we wouldn't have been able to say that, that this was the last year because some of that wood could have been eroded away. So we were starting to see some really interesting results of what's happening in the environment during this time. So these trees were experiencing some stress for the last 150 years of their life. We can also take these tree ring reconstructions and compare them to other bald cypress tree ring chronologies. So this is a Gini coefficient analysis. So our site here is the red arrow. And when you see darker colors, this is telling you that our Ice Age trees look like trees that are growing today, but these are occurring either further north of the Mississippi River Valley at higher elevations or over here in coastal South Carolina and North Carolina. So today, these locations are slightly colder in the wintertime than we are. We tend to have about the same summers. So this Gini coefficient analysis tells us a little bit of what the environment was like when these trees were alive. So it's not quite Gulf Coast, Florida, Texas. It's more like the Carolinas or up the Mississippi River. So one of the other things that's kind of interesting about working on this project, and this is some figures from a textbook that I use for teaching about the ice ages. And this is kind of what everybody thinks about the ice ages and trees, is that during the ice age, trees today that are growing up in Canada, so this is the spruce pollen, we find spruce pollen all throughout the Southeast, even down here to the Gulf Coast. And this is all coming from pollen reconstructions from lakes. But when you look at climate models, the climate models don't see the conditions down here along the Gulf Coast getting cold enough for spruce trees. And same thing here with looking at elm trees. What we see with the pollen records doesn't quite match up with what the climate models are telling us. So when I started working on this project, we were thinking, oh, are we going to find any of these trees that we find today in Canada down here on the Gulf Coast? And what's interesting is we're not really finding it. So going back to our sediment core, we've also gone in and looked at the pollen. And the pollen that we're finding in these sediment cores is very typical of what we see today. So bald cypress, tupelo trees, and pine trees. So Andy Reese up in Hattiesburg, he did the work here on the pollen from our DF1 core, and I'll walk you through this pollen diagram. So up here at the top left, I've got a transect from going onshore to offshore, and then I put the Gini coefficient map up here too. So we'll start off here at the bottom of the core, and the pollen assemblages that we see here are very typical of a modern day swamp that we see here along the Gulf Coast. Now, as we move up core, these assemblages start to change. And this is indicative of what's happening along the coast is changing. So you can imagine sea levels coming up, and as sea level comes up, the bald cypress do not like that salt water, so they tend to go away. And what we're getting is more of a grass open forest pollen assemblage. So you can imagine now we're closer to the shoreline. Then as we move up to the next assemblage, this is a levee bar forest. And this was one that was quite unique. And the only modern analog we find for this particular pollen assemblage occurs today up in North Carolina. So right along the coastline where you're getting these levees and bars forming along the coast. So just above that, we go into a grass assemblage. So here you can imagine we're closer to the ocean, not as many trees, and we're just getting all of our sea grasses growing. So through the pollen assemblage, we're seeing how vegetation is changing, but also we can track what's happening with sea level in our pollen as well. And you'll notice we don't see a lot of that spruce trees. We do see a little bit of elm trees here, but no spruce trees in any of this pollen assemblage. So, and then here at the top of the core, we're into our full marine Holocene section. So other things we find in our cores is we're also finding seeds. So, and this generally corresponds to what we're finding with the pollen records. So one of the things with pollen is it can be transported by wind and also by water. But when you find seeds, these tend to be heavier. They don't move as far. So again, this is further evidence that this was the vegetation that was occurring along the Gulf Coast at the time period when the forest was alive. So now kind of pulling together all of our sediment cores. So DF1, this is the core we've been looking at. So it's here in the middle of the site. It's got this nice thick sediment or Holocene sand sediment on top. We've got some cores over to the west and to the east, and we see this transition. And you can also start to see we have kind of this topography that's occurring throughout the site as well. And pulling this all together, we can generate a map of what this site looks like. So this 3D animation is showing the topmost layer as the current seafloor, or at least the seafloor back in 2015 and 16. The middle layer here is that transgressive surface, and then the bottom would be our previous last interglacial surface. And with this, you can see that there's quite a bit of topography in the site. And what's interesting is in the section that would have been the late Pleistocene, we see these deeper pockets. And this could have been that swamp deposits where we're getting more accommodation space to allow these sediments to accumulate. We also see that it looks like there's a natural levee that's occurring in this section. So it's rolling around right here. So we could have had a bayou or small stream right next to where this forest site was located. So that gives you a view of what the site would have looked like. So here's our hypothesis of what we think has happened with the site through time. And I'll walk you through this. So at the top, we have our sea level curve, and we're coming out of the last interglacial. So in sea level starting to drop. So for our first stop here at A, we're at 80,000 years ago. So here sea level is going to start dropping. So this continental shelf is becoming exposed, and we're going to start to get plant life colonizing this site as sea level drops. So during this time, we'll get to about 60,000 years ago. So now we have this full continental shelf exposed. We get our forests fully established. So this brackets our dates that we found with the OSL dating. And during this time, we're getting our floodplain and swamp sediments being deposited. And then as we move to stop C, here is right after one of these pulses in sea level rise. So from the Laurentide ice sheet melting. So during this time, when sea levels quickly rising, this could have caused the rivers to inland to back up, and could also have contributed to sediments being deposited over the forest site and giving us this nice thick layer of sediments bearing the site. And then after this time, after C, we're going to start to get these interbedded sands and muds being deposited. So all throughout the rest of the ice age, we have buried, exposed, erosion occurring, but because of that deep depression, it's being preserved. It's not being fully eroded away. And then as we move into the last glacial maximum, that sea level, it's still quite a bit offshore. We're starting to get other sand and peats being deposited. Oops, sorry. And eventually we go through the last glacial maximum and then into fully marine environments where we get our Holocene sands being deposited as we see today out offshore. So that's our sequence of what we think happened through time at the site. Oops, sorry. So now the past year, we've moved into phase 2 of the project, where we're going out doing more geophysical surveys. We have new sites that we're working on, and we're also taking more sediment cores. So here's just a map at the bottom showing the locations that we were working on last summer. So we've got 3 sites here along this east-west transect. We've got a site further south in 100 feet of water, and then 2 Adavin sites over here in Mississippi that we're also interested in, where he's found wood in his cores as well. This is still buried sites, and this wood is also coming back as radiocarbon dead. So, and this is this past summer out on the Point Sur doing some of our long vibrocore work. And we're still processing those cores, but I'll show you some of the data that's come back from the geophysical surveys that we did at the primary site and also at our new site. So over here on the right, this is the primary site, but we've expanded it here to the west. And at the top here, what we have is the 2015-2016 survey. And in the bottom image here, we've taken that one away, and you can see the 2021 survey. So what's interesting that's happened between 2016 and 2021 is the sand ridge has become quite a bit eroded, and this probably happened during Hurricane Sally. But we don't see this sand moving into the exposure of where the trees are. We've also got this new site here over to the west, where Kelly, our grad student who's working on this, has also identified some tree stumps. So this is one of our new sites. We also have a site to the east and to the west that has really interesting landforms. And she's also identified possible tree stumps in these locations. This bottom one is really interesting. In the side scan sonar, it has these interesting bed forms that they were finding. So we're working on investigating this more in this right now and then into the next summer. Up here is Kelly's new tree contacts. And what's interesting here is some of the trees that Jeff identified in 2016, some of them are still there, but now we've got some new ones that seem to have eroded out. And then here's that west site with the tree contacts. So the site keeps changing. One of the things we're really excited about doing next summer is we're bringing in a 3D chirp system from the UK, and we'll be surveying the primary site in high resolution next summer to image the still buried trees. So we'll get a better idea of what the distribution of trees are in the area. So other things we're doing in phase 2 is we're looking at pollen in our other sediment cores. So this is core DF3, which is right next to the divot, the exposure site. And she's finding very similar results to what we found at the other core we did the pollen rework on. So same type of progression. We're also looking at isotopes in the organic part of the sediment cores. So this is the 2 cores we've done the pollen work on, DF3 that I just showed you, and DF1. And we're seeing with the carbon and nitrogen isotopes, these same signatures that tell us we're looking at an inland freshwater forest versus a C3 marsh that's along the coast. So the isotopes are also helping to confirm what we're seeing in our pollen data. So other things that are being done is we have folks looking at shipworms in the wood that's been exposed and also buried. One of the interesting things we're finding is in the wood that's in the cores, we're not finding any evidence of shipworms. So this is telling us that that wood has stayed buried all through the last 50,000 years. And the wood that's newly exposed is where we're getting shipworms. Some of the work they're doing with the shipworms is they're identifying new shipworm species and identifying novel chemicals that the shipworms use that are of interest to biomedical researchers. So that's what this story here from the New York Times is saying, that the underwater forest one day could save your life. And then here's a picture of what these shipworms look like. Okay. So I'll end my talk there and just have some thanks here to our LSU Coastal Studies Institute and our research vessels and our funders. And then there's a little note there about the YouTube video about the project that Ben Raines put together.
Great, thank you so much, Kristine. That was awesome. I'm sure we have plenty of questions, so I'll help field the questions. You can raise your hand or type in the chat, or just go ahead and unmute if you like. Stephen Howden?
Yeah, thank you for that really interesting seminar. I was wondering, Hurricane Ivan had some incredibly large waves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I guess it's not surprising that maybe these were uncovered. But I was wondering if, they've been buried for a very long time. So could there be a role in, the loss of sediment transport by the rivers from from the Mobile Bay due to upstream damming and all that contributed to the conditions that would allow the hurricane to uncover these?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good observation. And that's something we've been thinking about, is the wood that we see in the cores, I don't see any evidence where it's been uncovered before. So you come back to either hurricanes are getting really strong on the Gulf Coast in recent years, and it's been in the marine environment for say maybe 10,000, 15,000 years. Or there's a loss of sediment. And now that sediment is no longer there, it's easier to uncover the site. So I think both of those hypotheses have merit, and it may be both or one or the other, but I think it's something really interesting to think about.
And one other thing, since, so it needs to be a site near a river, so you get the burial of the forest, but should there then be similar things in Louisiana, just, west of the Mississippi River Delta?
Yeah, there probably is burial out there, whether the wood is still there, if it's this old, maybe it's there, just nobody has, bothered to study it yet. I get, people who've worked for the oil companies, they email me and say, yeah, we were, drilling back in the 60s and 70s and hitting wood. And it's about the same depth that we're working on offshore. So that wood could have been the same age as what we're working on. Unfortunately, they didn't keep any of it. So that's one of the things I always ask is like, do you have any of the wood? If you have it, I'll send it off to get dated. So one of the guys over at Dolphin Island Sea Lab, they found a site back right before Christmas, and 85 foot of water. And they're sending me some of that wood to date. So I'll know, if that's from the same age as this site or if it's younger or older, once we get those dates. But yeah, and Mimi Fern, she had found some sites, closer to the coast, right along the Gulf Shores area that's all Holocene in age. So there is some Holocene wood, and then one of Davin's students put together a nice review paper where they found Holocene wood over on the Mississippi side of Mobile Bay and in the Mississippi Sound area. So there's definitely wood out there, and he's starting to find some wood that's also radiocarbon dead. So there may be quite a bit out there.
All right, I think Carrie Miller is next.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. DeLong, for a great talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to stay after and talk with you. So I will not bore everyone with all of these. I just had two clarifying questions that I thought everyone might also be interested in. How long does it take for shipworms to actually colonize exposed wood? Do we have an actual timeline for that? Because as you mentioned, most of the ones we find in cores, including the ones that we've split here in cores, we haven't been finding that. So I was just wondering if we actually had a timeline. Right. And I guess I'll let you answer that, and then I'll ask my second.
Yeah, no, a great question. So Dan has actually put out some wood to do those experiments to see how long it takes. So the wood he's been putting out has been yellow pine, and the shipworms are colonizing it pretty quick, and they're completely decomposed within about 3 months. So again, this is modern yellow pine. It's a softer wood. Bald cypress is it's a hardier wood. Back in the day, one of the big reasons it was heavily logged along the Gulf Coast was because it's resistant to rot and it's resistant to insects. So it was used for building materials, which is why we don't see any large bald cypress along the coast anymore, because it was all logged back in the 1800s. So that may be one of the reasons why the wood is persisting at the site a little longer than, a pine tree that was just cut down. So if the site was exposed by Ivan, that was 2004. So we're what, 16, 18 years later, and there's still stumps out there. And talking to Ben, maybe about a year ago, that log that we floated up to the surface in 2013, it now has a big hole in the middle of it. So it is decomposing, but not as quickly as some of the pine that Dan did the experiments with. So I think it depends on the type of wood. We know that the wood, it is decomposing some. So one of my students, Kendall, is working on doing the wood cellulose extractions on it. And we're finding that quite a bit of the cellulose has decomposed. Now, whether that happened from storing it for 7 years, or is it happening in the sediments, we don't know yet. So we'll hopefully be able to answer that question within the next year. So yeah, I think if the wood was to stay out there, eventually it would become petrified wood. It's not petrified right now. It's still wood. When you cut it, it smells like you're cutting a cypress tree. So it's not petrified yet. But eventually it would become petrified if it stays buried.
Okay. And that big log that y'all brought up to the surface and then had to drop, I guess, is that you guys have gone back and dove that site again, and that's how you know that there's a big, okay. And my second question was just back on slide 25, when you were talking about the seeds. I was wondering what the magnification scale was on that. Like how, if you just split a core, are those seeds, are you able to see those with the naked eye pretty easily, or do you have to wash the sediment off? Like what does that look like when you actually have split the cores?
Right. The bald cypress seeds are quite large, and those you can pick out. When Beth Middleton came over from the USGS to look at these cores the first time, she just started picking them out without even a microscope. Some of them are smaller and you need to use like a dissecting microscope to find them, but they're not too hard to see. So once you know what you're looking for.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Bettina, do you want to go?
Hi, yes, thank you so much for that presentation. This is such an interesting topic. I just wanted to know or ask, during the stressful last, 150 years, when you kind of saw that kind of change in that, in the cycles.
Right.
So is that possibly like due to like storms, flooding, or just something that's kind of that really caused that, or created the stress of like bringing in more saltier ocean waters, or has there, or yeah.
We've been thinking about all those things. One of the things that's been interesting working on this is we don't see similar sequences like this in other bald cypress trees collected. I had a previous one of our doctoral students, Clay Tucker, was looking at modern bald cypress that had experienced saltwater intrusion. And these sequences we see don't look like what he found in his trees. So, and now we kind of have a better idea of the ages of the site and how far it was inland. I don't think we're seeing saltwater intrusion here. So it could be some other stress event. We've looked at the wood for evidence of fires and insects or disease. We don't really see any of that. So there's hardly any charcoal in these cores. So it's not fire. It could be, hurricanes. It could be flooding events that are either freshwater or saltwater. This is the ice age. We've got a very large ice sheet melting, and most of that water is coming into the Gulf. So we could have seen flooding events occurring. So it could have been freshwater, or it could have been after that fresh water comes down the Mississippi, it's causing pulses in sea level rise on the coast as well. it's hard to say. So, and this is, you'll see at the bottom here, we still have in review for this paper. We're working on it. We're trying to figure out what's going on. And yeah, we don't exactly know. We've been able to eliminate a lot of things, but what exactly was the cause, we don't know. So, but Matt Farrell up in Tuscaloosa, he does a lot of work with bald cypress and flooding events. So it is something we keep talking with the folks who work with bald cypress, trying to see, you know, can we find a modern analog for what we see in these trees? So, and hopefully we can collect some more wood and possibly extend this chronology or get some more information. So I think it was just amazing that we were actually able to cross date any of this wood. So, which kind of tells us, like, even with the OSL dates, it's a huge range, but that's because of the uncertainty in that dating method. But to me, it's like to go out into a forest that's all dead and just randomly pick up 23 pieces of wood and 10 of them cross date, to me is just amazing. You know, when we go out and core trees today, you know, we can go out and core 50 trees and maybe we get half of those to cross date. You know, so just scuba diving and picking up random pieces of wood. I was amazed that we were able to cross date this, to be honest.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a couple questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just paraphrase. You know, the fact that it looks like the forest all died at the same time, do you think it's really all the flooding from the ice melting, or maybe there's sea level rise from, you know, coming from the Gulf side? Right.
Yeah, it would be great if we had better sea level records for the Gulf for this time interval. You know, most people focus on Holocene back to last glacial maximum. So the period between last glacial maximum and last interglacial, we just don't have a lot of information about it. And even those sea level curves I was showing you, those were global sea level curves. Those are not Gulf of Mexico curves. It could have been different in the Gulf. We don't know. And it's one of those things with paleoclimatology. Sometimes we just don't have the resolution. We just don't have the information. So we need more information to really figure that out. I do talk with some of the climate modelers who work in this interval as well. You know, thinking about these ideas of, did we have huge flooding events from rainfall events happening? Because we know during the Ice Age, the Gulf, the atmospheric jet stream shifts south. So when is it shifting south? And as it moves south, are we seeing larger flood events, more precipitation? We know it happens in the Southwest, because like places like Salt Lake City and Great Sand Dunes, those were all lakes at that time. So, but here on the Southeast, what's happening in the atmosphere at that time? So those are all things that we're thinking about. So did we get more precipitation type floods, or is this ocean floods? So is there more hurricanes during this time period? Yeah, they're all great questions. I don't have the answers for them.
All right. Well, in the interest of time, we'll close the formal seminar. We can all thank Kristine again for a great talk. But she does have a little more time. If anybody wants to stay on and chat in a smaller group, we can do that. So thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.